Alaska is a big place. Lots of room to let off steam.
Okay, all you gotta do is focus.
The neighborhood seemed very friendly, and my dad got along with everybody.
My dad was a happy guy and just really good with all the neighbors.
Even with all this space,
I took it as a personal threat to my child.
things can get too close for comfort.
I remember wanting my dad to just let it go.
I know what you're doing!
Wasilla, Alaska is more than a suburb of Anchorage. It's the gateway to America's last frontier.
It was great because you could ride snow machines down the roads, you could ride the horse on the trails. It was just an ideal neighborhood.
It wasn't like a high turnover rate, I guess you could say. When you grew up in there, you knew the same people your whole life.
This outdoorsman's paradise is perfect for Fred Heilman.
My dad moved to Alaska, and it was supposed to be a vacation, and he ended up never leaving.
Fred absolutely loved being outside, especially fishing, cutting his own wood, taking care of his property.
My dad worked on the tugboats as a cook deckhand.
And he ended up suffering an injury to his bicep. And he was no longer able to lift anything.
His neighbor for the last 6 years, Michael Zagers, is always around to help out.
Hey, Fred. You need a hand?
I think Michael Zagers had the definition of the Alaska spirit in him and showed it every day by being independent, being an extrovert, outward going, loving life.
Getting an early start to the weekend?
Yeah, my dad was known as a happy guy and just really good with all the neighbors, really good with, all our friends.
Thought I'd head out to Balsam Lake.
Got some good walleye there earlier. Have a good one.
Thanks.
He played a big part of why it was such a nice place to grow up, because he would go out of his way to meet the neighbors and lend a helping hand and, just be very friendly.
Michael is a busy contractor. After his wife's recent death, he has his hands full raising 2 rambunctious teens, Michael Zagers Jr. and younger brother, Anthony.
He was a great father. He definitely took care of those boys, and he would work as many hours as he could to make enough money to make the family happy.
Most of the time when it'll start like this, it's just a battery, boys. We'll check the fuse. Or it could just be that it's so muddy. All right, give it another try.
Michael's not the only single dad on the street.
Hey, come on.
What's going on?
We're just trying to fix the ATV here for the boys.
Oh, lucky boys.
Come on.
I had 2 kids living with me at the time of the divorce, so we were always comparing notes on the proper way to raise the kids.
Fred's children have left the nest,
All right.
but he still joins in from time to time.
Hey, guys, what's going on?
I'll check the tools. Hey, Fred, come on.
He was an easygoing guy, but he wouldn't just go out to make friends.
Don't give up. Let's try it again. Here. Let's try it now. There you go.
What'd you do?
It's a tight-knit little group
Good work, buddy.
Hey, you beat me, Tom!
that will soon be ripped apart. For now, East Porcupine Trail is an idyllic place to live, especially if you love being outside.
Okay, all you gotta do is focus.
Fred was a real gun enthusiast, and he loved to shoot,
And underneath. Okay, good for him.
and he always carried a pistol, which we thought nothing of in Alaska because 75% of the people in Alaska are armed. Michael Zagers had a pretty big ego, and he enjoyed competition a lot.
Hubbard, I kick your butt.
He was just competitive, and he enjoyed winning, and he enjoyed rubbing it in if he did win.
That's all right.
The target practice is all in good fun.
You'll get the next one.
Well, let's go, Pop. Give me that.
Until Michael decides to strut his stuff.
I got this, all right? Every time, what'd I tell you? What did I tell you?
I believe Fred Heilman took it a little different than the rest of us.
Safety first, okay? There's a right way and there's a wrong way.
Relax, Fred. Boys, say thank you to Fred for his time. Thanks Fred. Safety first, safety first. Get out of here.
Increasingly, small things begin to rub these neighbors the wrong way.
Being the outward-going guy he was, Michael Zaggers would announce his arrival in the neighborhood by beeping his horn 3 times.
Not everyone needs to be told Michael's home. Something else digs away at Fred. Michael's dog, Shadow.
Michael Zaggers had spent quite a bit of time in the villages of Alaska.
Come on, Shadow, you little bugger.
Where dogs are very common and dogs just run loose.
Hey, Mike. You gotta chain the dog, all right?
I'll relax, would you, Fred? The lawn looks great. Come on, Shadow. That's a good one. Come on. Come on, buddy. That's right, now. Come on, buddy.
I believe Fred retiring early gave him a lot more time to be around us and the neighborhood. And it kind of points out the old adage that familiarity can breed contempt.
In the summer of 2006, a special house guest moves in.
Hey, Dad.
I was away from work, and Danielle had went up home.
You made it.
Of course we did. Come on.
And she had moved in with her dad. She was going to stay there for about 4 or 5 months.
Meet your grandson, Dom.
Hey, Dom.
Hi.
Hey, can I hold him?
Yeah, of course. Hey.
Hey. Hey.
My father was very happy that we were moving in with them to spend some time with them. He was ecstatic.
Give Grandpa a smile. Come on.
Hi.
The family reunion soon comes under assault.
Zager's dog came running up towards us very aggressively, snarling.
Dad, can you go?
Inside.
Your heart starts pumping immediately.
Inside.
Shadow. Come on, Shadow.
You get that rush of adrenaline because you don't know what's going to happen.
Shadow. Come on.
It was very scary.
Okay. Come on, buddy. Shadow.
That made my dad extremely upset.
Chain up that dog. How long can I ask you?
Take it easy, Fred.
Seriously?
Could have been something very, very nasty.
Could kill my grandson.
He was extremely protective of me and my son.
Relax.
You relax. Get that dog out of here.
Zagers didn't care. It was almost like he just did what he wanted to do.
I gotta go. Come on.
Get him out of here. Get him out of here.
The time that he's lived there and been neighbors with people, I think Fred just felt very disrespected.
Shadow is a family dog who had a lot of energy and very playful. It's just absolute nonsense for Fred to feel threatened.
But Fred does feel threatened.
Get him on a chain next time.
Jeez.
And he sends his neighbors a warning.
What's Fred's problem anyway?
I don't know. It'll pass. Watch out, buddy. Come on. Ooh, good boy. Is there a problem?
Michael Zagers is fined $210 for allowing his dog to run unleashed.
My dog doesn't bite. We've lived here for 6 years and never had a complaint.
Sorry, sir. Law's the law.
I feel like my dad thought he was doing the right thing by getting the troopers involved. That he just wanted it to be quiet.
Unfortunately, this street will never be quiet again. On the contrary,
You know, how that one event with the dog and that one little interaction between Mike and Fred escalated so quickly, it's mind-boggling.
The incident with the dogs was the trigger in the entire thing.
Couldn't kill my grandson!
Relax.
From that day out, my dad kind of put up guards.
neighbors Michael Zagers and Fred Heilman got along for years, until Michael's dog Shadow got too close to Fred's grandson. Since his daughter Danielle and his grandson moved in for the summer, Fred's desire for peace and quiet has gone into overdrive. On a street full of teenagers, that's too much to expect.
I got this. Slow down! You killed somebody! You can't drive those around here, not at that speed!
Oh, come on, Fred. We're just trying to have fun, old man. Sorry about the noise.
Fred didn't like that my friend was driving a four-wheeler in the neighborhood. Apparently that's, prohibited. It was very common for kids to be riding four-wheelers or dirt bikes or snowmobiles throughout the neighborhood.
Shut up for just one day?
I know what 50, 60 miles an hour looks like, and that's what they were doing. And they'd only do it in front of his house. Once they went past his house, they'd slow down.
When no one listens to him or seems to care about his family's needs, Fred once again calls in the state troopers.
A lot of people in the neighborhood would have ATVs and snow machines. No one seemed to ever have an issue with the ATVs.
It's just a matter of it being a community and people need to follow the rules.
Wanting to have fun versus following the rules. Two very different ways of life. And there is no middle ground.
The whole neighborhood on the 4th of July for many years had gotten together and had a picnic on somebody's lawn. And then several of us would buy fireworks.
We had the loud ones, we had the whistling ones, we had the cracking ones. Yeah, pretty much all the good ones. Yeah.
A great time for the community. Loud and annoying for Fred and his family.
It was at the fire hazard.
What the hell are you doing now?
If it lands on someone's roof, it could start a fire, so he was highly irritated about that.
I got baby inside!
Let's stop.
Enough!
Just take it easy.
If you don't stop it, I will!
Fred came out and hollered at us to stop the fireworks.
Enough! Enough!
That just incensed Michael Zagers.
The kids are having fun! Go home!
Everybody, including myself, ignored him and his request to stop the fireworks.
Go home!
I think Fred felt like he was being disrespected considerably. He was being protective of his daughter and his daughter's baby.
Is he going nuts or something?
Everyone back to the party.
My dad was highly irritated.
It got to the point where he did call the state troopers.
You gotta be kidding me.
The troopers finally did show up, and they asked us politely, guys, we know there's a lot of this going on. Could we please stop it? It's starting to irritate the neighborhood.
Fred has shut the party down, and it looks like someone wants payback.
One of them took black cats and put them in a baby stroller and set it off. And I took that as a personal threat to my child, my, at this point, 7-month-old baby. How else am I supposed to take that? We didn't even call the troopers at that point. It was just every single time they were called out, nothing was happening, nothing was happening.
You guys are all sick! Jesus! I thought you were a man! You hear me? You're sick!
Danielle has been living with her father these past months, while her husband Brady has been working overseas. Now he's returning to Alaska.
I'm sorry.
If it wouldn't have been for him having to go to Fairbanks to go to school, I probably would have stayed with my dad. My father was very sad that I was leaving. But there was no, please don't go. I felt like I was abandoning my father. It felt horrible to leave him in that situation.
On his own again, Fred takes action to protect his space.
I think it was a great idea for him to put security cameras up. He needed to be able to document it, to have proof, to show the troopers what's going on.
I don't know why he had security cameras. I mean, everyone seemed to, for the most part, know each other and get along and trust each other.
I just saw a man who was paranoid. I don't know what he was paranoid of.
Hey, Porter! I know what you're doing, come on! You Porter, get out here! Come on! I don't want you looking at my kids!
Shadow ran off the porch and towards the edge of the yard. And as soon as Shadow ran across the yard,
Hey, you Porter! Stay!
Fred opened up with the shotgun. At that point, he knew he'd crossed the line, that he could never go back across again.
See this? What is it doing over there? It's putting up video cameras.
I don't think the boys ever considered that this would get violent.
Hey, you Porter! You Porter, get out here!
His neighbor's dog has run wild one time too many, and Fred Heilman has had enough.
I want you to stay away from my kids! Come on! Stay away from them! I warned you! I told you to keep that dog off my property!
What are you, crazy?
My dad didn't intend on shooting the dog. He didn't even shoot the dog. It was, get out of my yard. There's a leash law. And once again, you're not following the rules, and you're letting your dog run through somebody else's property.
Michael's not happy. And neither is neighbor Dennis Hubbard.
The bad thing about it is my children were in the front yard at that time, and I blew my sack. I hollered at Fred and told him, should you hurt one of my children over at shooting at a damn dog, I will end up shooting you.
What began as misunderstandings has become war.
Michael increased the frequencies of honking the horn when he came into the neighborhood, knowing that it would irritate Fred Heilman.
Hey, you peeping Tom!
He would just try to irritate Fred in any way he could.
Jeez. Now! Hey, Peeping Tom! Why don't you come on out, Peeping Tom?
Buddy, stop. You're making me nervous.
He deserves it.
I let Michael know that I wish he wouldn't do that, because you could be looking at a lot of trouble with Fred Heilman in the future.
I got a light for you. Help you film the children. What the hell's the matter with you? Let's go, Peeping Tom.
Let's go home.
Get on out here.
And Michael Saggers would laugh at me and say, what's he going to do, shoot me? He had a pair of handcuffs on his belt, and he started carrying a collapsible metal baton, 2 shoulder holsters, with a pistol under each arm.
What's all that for?
For self-defense.
And the handcuffs?
In case somebody needs restraint.
Kids, get in the house. Now.
It seemed very black and white. Don't go on his property, don't talk to Fred, don't socialize with him, stay away from the grumpy old neighbor, and don't go on his property.
Even this feud can't stop Christmas from coming, though there's not much peace and goodwill.
Great night.
Oh, looks great. I was starving.
We drove down from Fairbanks to spend Christmas Eve with my father, and it was a quiet night.
We thought it would be a great first Christmas with Dominic and Grandpa. And then next thing you know, just boom, bright lights right through the windows.
Michael Zaggers had borrowed my snowblower. He backed up in my driveway to my garage door to unload the snowblower, left the pickup running.
Not tonight!
Dad, what is it?
Not tonight!
Brady, go with him. Go!
One of my boys mentioned Fred's out front, and he's got a club.
Turn those lights off before I smash them off!
Fred, calm down. It's not like that.
And I go out there, and they're just screaming at Fred, what the you gonna do, Fred? You want to do this? They wanted something to happen. That's what they wanted.
I know what you're doing!
I'll turn him off when I want to turn him off.
Now! He's got a gun, you idiot! Get back!
Michael Zaggers liked to consider himself a man's man that would not back down from anything.
Why don't you take your hand off that gun and we'll settle this like men?
Michael Zaggers asking my father to fight like a man was showing that he was a full-grown bully.
I seriously thought that they were going to attack Fred right there in the middle of the street on Christmas Eve. For someone to pick on someone so consistently.
Not tonight!
And expect that there's never going to be a retaliation, it never happens that way.
What is? He's got a gun, you idiot! You're gonna get shot!
It's Christmas Eve. Neighbors Michael Zaggers and Fred Heilman are locked in a deadly standoff.
Dad! Dad, come inside, please!
Your adrenaline starts going and you're kind of scared because you don't know if something's gonna happen.
On the brink, cooler heads intervene.
Fred, let it go. Let's go back in. Go spend Christmas with your grandson.
We got the situation resolved. I got Fred to withdraw, and everybody went their separate ways.
And he never said a single word, not even to me, but he finally followed Danielle and I back into the house.
Everybody back inside.
You can only take that kind of harassment for so long. I even asked him to come and stay with us. We had an extra room.
Dad, it's time to move. We have plenty of room. Come with us.
If anyone's moving, it's them.
That was his house. He worked for that house. He didn't want to leave.
That's the thing about frontiermen. They don't back down. They stake their claim and do everything to defend it.
Shadow ran off the porch and towards the edge of the yard.
Easy, Fred. Put it down. Put it down. Shadow. Kill it. Put it down. Put it down. I know my right.
Fred Heilman claimed that he was aiming at the dog. Michael Zager's opinion was that Fred was aiming the gun directly at him and intending to threaten him.
Put it down.
I think both Fred and my dad, they both agreed that they didn't like each other. And I don't think that they were ever going to make bygones be bygones or have a truce or anything.
In the summer of 2007, Michael Zager's world is turned upside down, for the better. Reinhilde Graham works at his bank. She loves Michael's free spirit and his two boys. They're a perfect match.
I think Reinhilde was a very good influence on Michael Zagers, getting him to realize there was more to life. There was more to enjoy than having a neighborhood feud. He wasn't his normal Michael Zagers anymore. And he went out of his way to try to be as nice to Reinhilde as he could.
It's not long before Reinhilde moves in with Michael and meets her new neighbor.
Hi,
Mr. Hallman, I know you from the bank.
Ms. Graham.
It's nice to see you.
Can I share something with you?
Okay.
He's got a past. Maybe you should check his record.
Fred let Reinhilde know that Michael Zagers had a checkered past and may have been convicted of crimes in the past.
Possession, assault. Just thought you should know, in case you're getting serious.
I think Fred felt that was another way of getting even with Michael Zagers, is to hurt his relationship with Reinhilde.
When confronted, Michael comes clean.
Michael Zagers was very honest with Reinhilde.
It was 18 years ago.
Let's make dinner. The boys will be home soon.
What could have been a deal breaker brings the couple closer together. In May of 2008, Michael and Reinhilde go one step further. They get married. Together with Michael's boys, they embark on a new life.
Okay, come on.
Come on, boys.
Woo!
And look to leave the feud behind.
Get in the car.
Michael Zaggers was working on another house at that time. Reinhilty had convinced him that the best thing they could do was, let's just get out of the neighborhood and let's move into this house you're working on now. Let's start a new life, start a new house, start a new everything. And Michael Zaggers grasped that idea and ran with it.
Clearly, I remember wanting my dad to just let it go and just to move out of the house into the new house.
Michael, let's go. Mike.
I believe that would be the end of all the animosity and the end of the feud, and we could finally breathe a sigh of relief in the neighborhood.
Their departure marks a new chapter for Fred Heilman. Maybe now he can enjoy the peaceful retirement he's long dreamt of. That's not going to happen.
Michael Zaggers came to the neighborhood and stopped at the mailbox to check the mail.
Zaggers had taken the long way to go right in front of Fred's house.
Keep in mind that Fred, whenever he was out in his yard, is armed.
I was worried for my dad's safety because at that point, seeing the stuff that Zaggers was already capable of and just being the way that he was, I didn't know that if my dad did walk out into the street, if he would just attack my father.
After 4 long years, the bitter conflict is about to come to a head.
What happened?
I wanted my dad to just kind of let things go. You're never going to get that warm, fuzzy feeling you get deep and down inside, thinking that you may have got a victory over him. That's never going to happen.
Everyone in the neighborhood knows about the feud between these two men.
If you don't stop it, I will! Get out of here! I'll turn him off when I want to turn him off. No! Kill my grandson! Easy, Fred. Oh, kill it! Put it down! You guys are all sick! Stay away from me! I warned you!
No one really knows what triggers the final chapter.
I believe that Michael Zaggers and Fred Heilman exchanged words at the mailbox.
This is where I've heard 2 different versions, that Zaggers was yelling at Fred. I was also told that he was driving his truck and then he kind of swerved it towards Fred.
Michael had moved on from the feud, but did not miss an opportunity to insult or taunt Fred.
I believe that Fred literally did feel his life was threatened at that exact moment.
I don't know what possessed Fred Heilman to draw his weapon. As Michael Zaggers ran towards my front door, he never made it to my front door because Fred had shot him numerous times.
Hit 6 times. Michael Zaggers dies, just yards from his old driveway.
And Fred got his lawnmower, started it, went and parked it in the garage. And I think it's one of those, right after he did it, he realized he did it, and there's nowhere for him to go but to spend the rest of his life in jail, and he's not going to let that happen.
I was driving home, and my dad called me.
Hello?
I did it.
You did what?
I shot him.
Was the first thing that he said. And I was like, you did what and you shot who? And he said, I killed Michael Zagers.
I couldn't take any more.
Dad.
And then I called the troopers and let them know that he had called me and what had happened.
I think my dad just did something really bad.
Just came in crying, screaming in the house, and I'm like, I'm trying to figure what's going on. And she's like, he shot him. And I didn't have to ask who or what. I already knew. As soon as she goes, he shot him, I was like, okay.
And I literally threw stuff in a bag, threw my kid in the car, and we drove 350 miles. They gave us permission to speed there as fast as we could.
Michael Zagers' two sons, Anthony and Michael Jr., were not at home when their father was slain.
We got a phone call from a neighborhood girl saying that there may have been a shooting. And my brother, he kind of just brushed it off. And then finally, suddenly, we get a phone call from our neighbor, Dennis, who then told us to immediately get back as soon as we possibly could.
The neighborhood was blocked off with cop cars.
What happened?
Guys, you'll have to stand behind the line.
Everyone all right?
Guys, I said behind the line.
I was threatened. I was crushed because I knew it couldn't be good. So I was in a panic.
Then, Michael Jr. and Anthony get the news they've been dreading.
Cops came and they finally told us the confirmation that my dad had died. And at that moment, everybody was just, everyone became emotional and everyone was just crushed. Everyone was devastated.
Where is he? Dad!
Are you dead? It's okay. It's okay. It's okay.
And he was pretty much barricaded in there. He was in the house. They could see him through the windows and see him walking around.
Hey!
Dad!
Put your head down!
Hey!
Dad!
Come on! Shoot me!
You dropped that weapon!
I could hear Fred. I can hear him screaming, shoot me, just do it, just shoot me already.
Come on, shoot me!
He was trying to get them to shoot him, is what he was trying to do, because he didn't want to take his own life. So he was trying to do suicide by cop.
Shoot me!
Fred was not a violent, mean person. He never wanted to hurt anybody intentionally, ever. That's why I remember telling Danielle, I was like, the cops aren't going to shoot him because he's not going to point his gun at the cops.
Dad! Let me go to him, please! Let me go to him!
Danielle and Brady aren't allowed to talk to Fred. Troopers say it's too dangerous. The area is cleared of everyone except police. And the standoff goes on. Fred holed up inside his home, refusing to come out. The troopers waiting and watching. Fred has a meal. At some point, he reads his Bible. Then, after almost 24 hours holding the police at bay,
Hands up! Let's go!
I was horrified. I mean, it's very overwhelming experience. I mean,
we went to the hospital, and they had put him in an ambulance and tried to revive him, and then they came out and let us know that he didn't make it.
I was crushed that I had lost my dad. When Fred took his own life, I didn't really feel anything. I wasn't happy. I didn't feel justice. I was in mourning of my dad having just died.
And I felt just horrific for the families on either side. And that was the first thing Danielle and I were thinking. It's like, it's no longer about Mike and Fred, you know, and now it's about everybody else left behind.
There was a noticeable difference in the neighborhood on how quiet it got. It took days before the neighbors even talked to each other and broached the subject of what went on. It was like the whole neighborhood was in mourning.
It was definitely tough for the next few months following. Life goes on, and just can remember the good memories I have with him.
Fred's house is eventually sold. Dennis Hubbard sells his house and abandons the neighborhood. Michael Jr. and Anthony leave Alaska for college and now live in the lower 48.
It was time for the neighborhood to move on and regenerate itself with some new people.
it's tragedy on both sides. This should have never happened.
The rain had been falling for hours over Port Coquitlam, the kind that didn't crash down in storms but instead settled into everything, into the soil, into the wood, into the silence. It soaked the gravel roads until they turned to dark paste, clinging to boots and tires alike. It softened the edges of the world, blurring the boundary between what was seen and what was hidden. Out beyond the dim scatter of streetlights, past the neat suburban homes and the hum of distant highways, there was a stretch of land that most people didn't think about. A place that didn't appear on postcards or tourist maps. A place where the air carried a different weight. The farm didn't look unusual at first glance. A few low buildings. Rusted equipment leaning into itself. Fences that had long since stopped pretending to keep anything in or out. And then there were the pigs. Always the pigs. Moving in restless clusters, their bodies pressing into one another, their sounds cutting through the quiet in sharp, sudden bursts. To an outsider, it might have seemed like any other rural property struggling to stay afloat. But there was something about the stillness between those sounds. Something that lingered too long. People in the area had stories, though they rarely told them outright. Not at first. It would come out in fragments, in pauses between sentences, in the way someone might glance toward the direction of the property without meaning to. There were whispers about late-night gatherings, about strangers coming and going, about lights that stayed on long after they should have gone dark. But whispers have a way of dissolving before they ever become warnings. And then there were the disappearances. In the streets of Vancouver's downtown east side, women vanished with a quiet that felt almost procedural. No shattered glass. No screaming witnesses. Just absence. A missed appointment. A phone call that never came. A bed that stayed empty. Many of them lived lives already pushed to the margins, women navigating addiction, poverty, survival. Their routines were fragile, their safety conditional. When they disappeared, it didn't always register as an emergency. Not right away. Time stretched. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Names began to stack up in conversations that didn't quite reach the surface. Each one a person who had once laughed, argued, hoped for something better. Each one now reduced to a question that no one seemed able or willing to answer. Some families refused to let that silence settle. They called police. They searched shelters. They walked the streets themselves, asking questions that led nowhere. They clung to photographs, to memories, to the stubborn belief that someone, somewhere, knew something. But the system moved slowly, and sometimes it didn't move at all. Reports were filed. Notes were taken. And then, Too often, nothing happened. Far away from the city's neon glow, the farm continued its quiet existence. Trucks came and went. Supplies were delivered. Music sometimes echoed across the property during gatherings that blurred the line between celebration and chaos. People drifted in and out of those nights, some remembered, some not. The man at the center of it all, Robert William Picton, did not draw much attention to himself. He wasn't loud in the way that demands scrutiny. He didn't need to be. He moved through his routines with a kind of practiced normalcy, as though everything around him existed exactly as it should. But normalcy can be a carefully constructed illusion. There were moments, small, almost forgettable moments, when that illusion faltered. A neighbor noticing something off but dismissing it as none of their business. A visitor leaving the property with an uneasy feeling they couldn't quite explain. A worker recalling details that didn't seem important until much later, when hindsight sharpened everything into focus. Each moment, on its own, meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern that no one fully saw in time. The rain didn't stop that night. It pressed against the roofs of the farm buildings, seeped into the earth, pooled in the uneven ground. Somewhere in that darkness, beneath layers of soil and debris, beneath the routines of feeding and cleaning and living, there were secrets. Not the kind that fade with time, but the kind that wait. And far from the farm, in a city that had already learned how to look away, another woman stepped into the night and did not come back. Her absence would not make headlines the next morning. There would be no urgent broadcasts, no citywide searches. Just another space left behind. Another story interrupted. Another name added to a list that was growing longer than anyone wanted to admit. If you stood at the edge of that farm and listened carefully, you might have heard it, not a sound exactly, but a tension in the air, as though the land itself was holding something in. Something heavy. Something unresolved. Because this wasn't just a story about a man or a place. It was a story about how something terrible can exist in plain sight. How it can grow quietly, fed by neglect, by assumptions, by the gaps in a system meant to protect. And how, by the time the truth begins to surface, it's already far too late. The first real crack in the silence wouldn't come from a confession. It wouldn't come from a witness stepping forward with clarity and certainty. It would come from something smaller. Something almost incidental. A detail that didn't belong, discovered during an investigation that had nothing to do with missing women, at least, not at first. And when that crack finally opened, it wouldn't just reveal a crime. It would reveal a scale of horror that no one had been prepared to face. A farm. A man. And a number that kept growing, long after anyone could pretend it was a coincidence. Somewhere between 40 and 50. Maybe more. And by the time anyone understood what those numbers meant, the rain had already washed away years of chances to stop it. To understand how something like this could happen, how it could grow, undetected, for years, you have to begin long before the crimes themselves. You have to step into a place and a time where everything felt ordinary, even when it wasn't. Because nothing about this story begins with violence. It begins with quiet. With routine. With a landscape that seemed too mundane to hide anything at all. Port Coquitlam sits on the outskirts of the Greater Vancouver area, a place where suburban streets slowly dissolve into stretches of farmland and forest. It is not remote in the way that suggests isolation from the world, but it is distant enough that things can exist just beyond notice. In the 1990s, it was a town defined by its in-betweenness, not quite rural, not quite urban. A place where neighbors waved from driveways, where people recognized familiar faces at grocery stores, and where life moved at a pace that rarely invited suspicion. But even in places like this, there are edges. Not geographical ones, but social ones. Lines that separate who is seen from who is overlooked. Roughly 30 kilometers away, Vancouver's downtown east side told a very different story. It was a neighborhood layered with contradictions. On one hand, it pulsed with life, small businesses, community centers, people carving out survival in whatever ways they could. On the other hand, it carried the weight of systemic neglect. Addiction, poverty, and marginalization were not abstract issues here, they were daily realities. The streets bore witness to lives lived in cycles of instability, where safety was never guaranteed and trust was often a luxury. It was here that many of the women who would later disappear spent their days and nights. They were not invisible to each other. They formed networks, friendships, fragile support systems that helped them navigate a world that often treated them as disposable. They knew the risks. They knew the dangers of getting into a stranger's car, of trusting the wrong person, of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But knowing those risks did not eliminate them. It only made survival a constant negotiation. And yet, despite the dangers, life went on. There were moments of laughter, of connection, of hope that something better might still be possible. These women were not defined solely by their circumstances. They were daughters, sisters, friends. They had stories that extended far beyond the streets they walked. But those stories were rarely told in full. Not by the media. Not by the institutions meant to protect them. This disconnect, the distance between Port Coquitlam and the downtown East Side, was not just physical. It was psychological. What happened in one place did not always register in the other. When a woman disappeared from the city, it did not automatically trigger alarm bells in the suburbs. It did not lead people to look toward a pig farm miles away and wonder if there might be a connection. That farm, owned by Robert William Picton and his brother, existed in a kind of liminal space. It was known, but not truly known. People had heard of it. Some had been there. Others had only caught glimpses of it in passing, a stretch of land with aging structures, the faint smell of livestock carried on the wind. It was the kind of place that didn't invite curiosity. If anything, it discouraged it. The property itself was sprawling and uneven, a patchwork of buildings, machinery, and open areas that seemed to have evolved without any clear plan. There were barns and sheds, some functional, others falling into disrepair. There were piles of scrap metal, abandoned equipment, and objects whose original purpose had long been forgotten. It was cluttered in a way that blurred distinctions, where nothing stood out because everything felt slightly out of place. During the day, it functioned as a working farm. Animals were fed. Chores were completed. There was a rhythm to it, a sense of routine that masked anything beyond the surface. But at night, the atmosphere shifted. Lights would flicker on in unexpected places. Music might drift across the property. People would arrive, some invited, some simply following the promise of a party, a place to escape, a temporary reprieve from their own lives. These gatherings were chaotic, unpredictable. Accounts from those who attended describe an environment where boundaries felt loose, where behavior that might raise concern elsewhere was brushed aside as part of the experience. Alcohol flowed. Drugs were present. Strangers mingled without asking too many questions. In that setting, it was easy for someone to disappear, not in a dramatic, attention-grabbing way, but in a quiet, almost administrative sense. Someone leaving early. Someone stepping outside and not coming back. Someone assumed to have gone home. And assumptions, in this story, would prove to be one of the most dangerous elements of all. Because while the farm appeared disordered, there was a kind of control embedded within it. Not obvious, not overt, but present nonetheless. It existed in the routines that governed the space, in the way certain areas were used, in the unspoken understanding of who belonged where and when. To an outsider, it might have felt like chaos. To someone familiar with it, it was something else entirely. Meanwhile, in the city, the pattern of disappearances continued to build. At first, it was easy to treat each case as an isolated incident. A woman missing for a few days. Then returning. Or not returning, but assumed to have moved on, to have left the area, to have started over somewhere else. There were always explanations available, plausible, even comforting in their simplicity. But over time, those explanations began to strain under the weight of repetition. Families noticed. Community advocates noticed. Names were remembered. Faces were not forgotten. There were efforts, small at first, then growing, to bring attention to what was happening. Posters were put up. Meetings were held. Questions were asked with increasing urgency. Why were so many women disappearing? Why did it seem like no one was connecting the dots? The answers, when they came, were often unsatisfying. Limited resources. Lack of evidence. The transient nature of the population. Each explanation carried a degree of truth, but none addressed the full scope of the problem. And in the absence of clear answers, uncertainty took root. It is important to understand that the setting of this story is not just about geography. It is about systems. About the ways in which certain lives are prioritized over others. About how patterns can go unnoticed when they occur within communities that are already marginalized. The distance between Port Coquitlam and the downtown east side was measured not just in kilometers, but in attention, in urgency, in whose stories were considered worthy of immediate action. On the surface, everything continued as it always had. The farm operated. The city moved forward. People went about their lives, unaware of how closely these two worlds were connected. There was no single moment where everything shifted, no dramatic event that forced recognition. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of unease, of unanswered questions that lingered just beneath the surface. And beneath that surface, something was growing. Not suddenly. Not chaotically. But steadily, methodically, over years. Hidden within routines. Concealed by assumptions. Protected, in part, by the very structure of the world around it. If you had visited the farm during those years, you might not have seen anything that would immediately alarm you. You might have noticed the clutter, the smell, the noise of the animals. You might have felt a vague discomfort, the kind that is easy to dismiss once you leave. You would not have seen the full picture. No one did. Not all at once. And that is what allowed it to continue. Because horror, in this case, did not announce itself. It did not break through the surface in obvious ways. It existed in fragments, scattered across places and people who did not yet realize they were part of the same story. A missing woman in the city. A late-night gathering on a farm. A neighbor who chose not to ask questions. A system that moved too slowly. Individually, each of these elements could be explained away. Together, they formed something far more dangerous, a setting in which the unthinkable could happen, again and again, without interruption. By the time anyone began to see the connections clearly, the story had already been unfolding for years. And the setting, quiet and unassuming as it seemed, had been there all along, holding every piece in place. Before the numbers, before the headlines, before the farm became a place people would only speak about in lowered voices, there were names. Not statistics, not case files, not blurred photographs attached to news segments, but real women whose lives stretched far beyond the moments they would later be remembered for. To understand what was lost, you have to step into those lives, not at their end, but somewhere in the middle, where hope still existed, where routines still felt familiar, where the future had not yet been quietly erased. In Vancouver's downtown east side, mornings did not begin with alarm clocks or quiet cups of coffee. They began with movement. With people stepping out into the streets early, some already tired from nights that never quite ended, others trying to piece together the start of a new day. The air carried a mixture of sounds, traffic in the distance, voices rising and falling, the occasional burst of laughter that felt almost defiant against everything else. It was a place where survival required constant awareness, where every decision carried weight, even the smallest ones. Among the women who lived and moved through these streets were individuals whose stories rarely reached beyond the neighborhood itself. Women like Sarah, who had once talked about becoming a nurse, who still kept an old notebook filled with scribbled plans she wasn't ready to let go of. Women like Angela, who could remember the exact smell of her grandmother's kitchen and would describe it in vivid detail whenever conversations turned to home. Women like Lisa, who had a way of making others laugh even on days when nothing seemed worth laughing about. Their lives were not defined by a single narrative. They were layered, complicated, shaped by choices and circumstances that often intersected in ways no one had prepared them for. Some had grown up in stable environments before things shifted, family breakdowns, economic hardship, trauma that followed them into adulthood. Others had known instability from the beginning, learning early on how to navigate systems that were not designed with them in mind. What connected many of them was not just where they lived, but how the world responded to them. Opportunities were limited. Support systems were inconsistent. And over time, the line between surviving and simply enduring became harder to distinguish. Yet even within that reality, there were moments of connection that mattered deeply. Friendships formed quickly and intensely, built on shared experiences and an understanding that did not require explanation. They looked out for each other when they could. They warned each other about dangerous clients, about areas to avoid, about people who made them uneasy. Information moved through the community in quiet, informal ways, conversations on street corners, quick exchanges between passing acquaintances, gestures that carried meaning without needing words. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was something. And in a world where formal protections often fell short, something was better than nothing. But even within these networks, there were gaps. A woman might not show up for a few days, and at first, it wouldn't immediately trigger alarm. People came and went. Some left the area temporarily. Others tried to start over somewhere else. Absence, in this context, did not always signal danger. It was only when the absence stretched longer than expected, when familiar faces failed to reappear over weeks instead of days, that concern began to settle in. And even then, that concern didn't always translate into action beyond the community itself. Families, when they were still in contact, felt the shift more sharply. A missed phone call. A letter that never arrived. A silence that felt different from the ones that had come before. For some, the distance between them and their loved ones made it harder to know exactly when something was wrong. But there was an instinct, a quiet recognition that something had changed in a way that could not be easily explained. They held on to memories as a way of resisting that uncertainty. Small, specific details that anchored their loved ones in reality. The way someone laughed, not just that they laughed. The exact phrases they used, the habits that made them unique. These memories became a form of presence, a way of keeping someone close even as the physical distance grew. For the women themselves, daily life required a balance between caution and necessity. Trust was not given easily, but it could not be withheld entirely either. Work often meant interacting with strangers, making quick judgments about who seemed safe and who didn't. It meant navigating risks that were understood but never fully controllable. There were routines within that uncertainty, certain streets that felt more familiar than others, places where people gathered, where information was exchanged, where brief moments of rest could be found. Over time, these routines created a sense of rhythm, a structure that made life feel, if not stable, then at least predictable. And then something would disrupt that rhythm. A conversation cut short. A plan that didn't materialize. A woman saying she would be back soon and then not returning at all. The last sightings were often unremarkable in isolation. Someone getting into a vehicle. Someone walking toward a destination they had visited many times before. Someone mentioning a new opportunity, a way to make money, a chance to step outside the usual patterns. These moments did not stand out at the time. They blended into the flow of everyday life. It was only later, when those moments were revisited, that their significance began to emerge. Descriptions surfaced slowly. A man who seemed ordinary enough. A vehicle that didn't draw attention. An interaction that, at first glance, appeared no different from countless others that had taken place before. There was no single detail that screamed danger. No obvious sign that this moment would be the last time someone was seen. And that was part of what made it so difficult to grasp. Because the women who disappeared were not careless. They were not unaware of the risks around them. They navigated those risks every day, often with a level of awareness that people outside their world did not fully understand. But awareness does not guarantee safety, especially when the threat is not immediately visible. As more women failed to return, the sense of unease within the community deepened. Patterns were discussed, even if they were not yet fully formed. There was a growing feeling that these were not isolated incidents, that something or someone might be connecting them. But without concrete evidence, without official acknowledgement, those suspicions remained just that. Suspicions. Still, the names continued to accumulate. Each one representing a life that had intersected with countless others. Each one leaving behind a network of people who felt the absence in different ways. Friends who replayed their last conversations, searching for anything they might have missed. Family members who refused to accept easy explanations, who pushed for answers even when those answers were slow to come. And beneath it all, a quiet, persistent question began to take shape. Not just what had happened, but why it seemed to be happening without interruption. Why the disappearances continued. Why the responses felt insufficient. Why the women at the center of it all seemed to exist in a space where urgency was always just out of reach. Their stories, individually, were rich with detail, with emotion, with complexity. But as they began to intersect within the broader narrative, they were at risk of being reduced to something far simpler. A list. A pattern. A problem to be solved. What must not be lost, even as the investigation unfolds, is the reality that each of these women lived full lives before they were ever considered victims. They made choices, formed relationships, held on to dreams that extended beyond the circumstances they found themselves in. They were not defined by the way their stories ended, even if that is how the world would eventually come to know them. And somewhere, in the space between those lives and the place where they would ultimately disappear, there was a connection waiting to be uncovered. A connection that, once revealed, would force a reckoning not only with the crimes themselves, but with everything that had allowed them to continue for so long. Because the story of the victims is not just about loss. It is about visibility. About whose lives are seen, whose are overlooked, and what happens in the spaces where attention fails to reach. By the time that attention finally arrived, it would bring with it a realization that was as devastating as it was unavoidable. This was never just about one woman. And it was never just about one moment. It was about many lives, intersecting in ways no one had fully understood until it was far too late. It never began with a scream. There was no single moment where the night shattered, no instant where everything clearly broke apart. Instead, it began the way so many things did in that part of Vancouver, quietly, almost invisibly, folded into the routine of survival. A conversation. A passing offer. A decision made in seconds, shaped by circumstances that had been building for years. The evening air in the downtown East Side carried its usual contradictions. Neon lights flickered against worn building facades, casting uneven glows onto sidewalks that had seen too much and remembered everything. People moved in familiar patterns, some with purpose, others drifting between moments, navigating a world that rarely paused for them. There was a rhythm here, imperfect but consistent, and most nights followed its unspoken rules. On one of those nights, a woman stood at the edge of a street she knew well. She had walked this stretch countless times before, knew where to stand, where to avoid, how to read the subtle cues that signaled risk. There was nothing outwardly different about this moment. No sudden sense of danger, no instinct screaming that something was wrong. Just another night, another decision. A vehicle slowed. It didn't draw attention. Cars came and went all the time, their presence woven into the fabric of the street. The driver wasn't unfamiliar in the way that would immediately trigger alarm. He didn't present urgency or aggression. If anything, there was a kind of calmness, a controlled normalcy that made the interaction feel routine. Words were exchanged. Brief. Practical. The kind that didn't leave a lasting impression. And then, she got in. The door closed with a soft, unremarkable sound. The vehicle pulled away, merging back into the flow of the city as though it had never paused at all. To anyone watching, if anyone had been watching closely enough, it would have looked like countless other encounters that happened every night. But this one did not end the same way. The drive out of the city was gradual, almost imperceptible in its transition. Streetlights thinned. Buildings gave way to open stretches of road. The noise of the city faded, replaced by something quieter, more expansive. It wasn't an unusual route for someone leaving Vancouver, and there was nothing about it that immediately suggested danger. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere may have shifted in subtle ways. A change in tone. A pause where there shouldn't have been one. Small details that, in hindsight, might have carried meaning but in the moment felt ambiguous, open to interpretation. It's often like that, the difference between safety and threat not marked by clear boundaries, but by nuances that are easy to overlook until it's too late. By the time the vehicle reached Port Coquitlam, the world outside had grown darker, quieter. The roads were less traveled. The sense of being seen, of being part of something larger, had diminished. Here, isolation didn't announce itself. It settled in gradually, until it became the default. The entrance to the farm was not imposing. No gates that suggested secrecy, no barriers that warned people away. Just a path leading inward, toward a property that revealed itself piece by piece. The outlines of buildings emerged in the darkness. The shapes of machinery, of structures that had stood for years without drawing much attention. And then, the animals. The presence of pigs was unmistakable. Their movement, their sounds, created a backdrop that was both ordinary for a farm and strangely unsettling in its persistence. It was a constant noise, one that filled the spaces between everything else. The vehicle came to a stop. What happened next did not unfold in a single, linear sequence. There were no witnesses to mark each moment, no recordings to capture the progression from ordinary interaction to something far more final. But patterns, established over time, offer a framework. A way of understanding what likely occurred, even when the exact details remain out of reach. She would have stepped out of the vehicle into an environment that felt unfamiliar, even if she had been told what to expect. The ground uneven beneath her feet. The air carrying the mixed sense of livestock and decay, though not in a way that immediately signaled danger. Just the smell of a working farm, layered with something harder to define. Inside one of the buildings, the sense of normalcy would have begun to erode. There is often a moment in situations like this, a brief, fragile instant where realization begins to surface. Where something feels off in a way that can no longer be ignored. It doesn't arrive all at once. It builds, piece by piece, as small inconsistencies accumulate. A door that closes too deliberately. A movement that doesn't align with expectation. A shift in presence that transforms the space entirely. And then, the moment passes. What followed, in those isolated spaces, was not chaos in the way it is often imagined. It was controlled. Repeated. A pattern carried out with a familiarity that suggests it had been practiced, refined over time. The violence itself, while central to the act, was not the only defining element. It was the context in which it occurred, the isolation, the lack of interruption, the certainty that no one would arrive unexpectedly to break the sequence. Outside, the farm remained as it always had. The animals moved. The night continued. The world beyond the property carried on, unaware of what was unfolding just beyond its awareness. There were no sudden disruptions, no signals sent outward that something irreversible had taken place. Time passed. And with it, the immediate traces of what had occurred began to disappear. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is not just the act itself, but what followed. The deliberate effort to erase evidence, to remove any indication that a life had ended within those spaces. It was not a hurried process. It did not rely on luck. It was systematic, carried out in a way that suggested an understanding of how to avoid detection. The farm, with its clutter and complexity, provided an environment where distinctions blurred. Where organic and inorganic materials mixed. Where the presence of animals created a natural cover for processes that might otherwise have drawn attention. It was a setting uniquely suited to concealment, not because it was designed that way, but because it existed in a form that allowed it. And so, what had begun as a brief interaction on a city street concluded in a place far removed from it, without witnesses, without interruption, without immediate consequence. Back in Vancouver, the absence would not be felt right away. A missed check-in. A delay in returning to a familiar spot. At first, these were not unusual occurrences. But as hours turned into days, and days into something longer, the absence began to take on weight. Questions emerged, tentative at first, then more insistent. When was the last time anyone saw her? Who was she with? Where was she supposed to go? The answers, when they came, were incomplete. Fragments of memory, pieces of information that didn't yet form a coherent picture. Someone might recall seeing her getting into a vehicle. Another might remember a brief conversation earlier in the evening. But no one had the full story. No one had followed that vehicle out of the city, down the quieter roads, onto the property where everything changed. And so, the incident became something else. Not an event with a clear beginning and end, but a gap. A space where a person had been, and then was no longer. A silence that settled in slowly, resisted at first, then gradually accepted as part of a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. What makes this part of the story so difficult to confront is its repetition. Because this was not a single, isolated event. The same sequence, with variations, played out again and again over the years. Different nights. Different women. But the same underlying structure. The same movement from visibility to isolation. From presence to absence. Each time, the world outside the farm continued as though nothing had changed. And each time, another life was quietly removed from it. There were no headlines marking these moments as they happened. No immediate recognition of their significance. Just a series of incidents that, individually, did not demand attention in the way they should have. It would take years for those incidents to be connected. Years for the pattern to be fully acknowledged. Years before the place where it all converged would be examined closely enough to reveal what had been hidden there for so long. By then, the number of incidents would no longer be something that could be easily grasped. It would be something far more difficult to comprehend. Because behind each incident was a person. And behind each person was a story that had been cut short, not in a moment of chaos, but in a sequence that had been allowed to continue, uninterrupted, for far too long. The first break in a case like this rarely arrives with clarity. It doesn't announce itself as the turning point, doesn't carry the weight of revelation in the moment it happens. Instead, it appears small, almost incidental, something that could have been overlooked, dismissed, filed away as unrelated. And for a long time, that is exactly what happened. Years had already passed. The pattern of disappearances had stretched thin across time, diffused enough that no single moment demanded urgent action. In Vancouver, conversations about missing women had grown more persistent, more difficult to ignore, but still lacked the cohesion needed to force a decisive response. There were reports, there were concerns, there were names, but there was no single thread strong enough to pull everything together. Meanwhile, the farm in Port Coquitlam continued to exist in its familiar state of controlled disorder. To an outsider, it looked like it always had cluttered, active, unremarkable in its own rough way. Nothing about it suggested that it would soon become the center of one of the largest forensic investigations in Canadian history. The moment that changed everything did not begin with the missing women. It began with a separate investigation, one that had nothing to do with disappearances, nothing to do with patterns stretching back years. It was smaller, more contained. A complaint. An allegation involving illegal possession of firearms. The kind of case that, under normal circumstances, would be handled quickly and quietly, resolved without drawing broader attention. But circumstances are rarely that simple. When officers arrived at the property owned by Robert William Picton, they were not stepping into the case they would later come to understand. They were following a lead, executing a search that was routine in its intention, if not in its setting. The farm presented challenges immediately, not because of anything overtly threatening, but because of its sheer complexity. Buildings scattered across the land, objects layered upon objects, spaces that blurred into one another without clear boundaries. Searching a place like that requires patience. It requires a willingness to move slowly, to examine details that might otherwise be dismissed. And at first, that is exactly what the officers did. They moved through the property methodically, focusing on the task at hand, looking for evidence related to the firearms allegation that had brought them there in the first place. But then, something didn't fit. It wasn't dramatic. Not at first. A detail out of place, an object that raised questions rather than providing answers. The kind of discovery that doesn't immediately signal its importance, but lingers in the mind just long enough to resist being ignored. In many cases, such details are noted and set aside, especially when they fall outside the scope of the original investigation. This time, it was different. As the search continued, more inconsistencies began to surface. Items that did not align with the expected environment of a working farm. Personal belongings that suggested a presence beyond the people known to frequent the property. Each discovery, on its own, could have been explained. But together, they formed a pattern that was increasingly difficult to dismiss. The officers began to shift their perspective. What had started as a focused search for specific evidence was becoming something broader, more uncertain. Questions emerged, not just about the items being found, but about the context in which they existed. Why were they there? Who did they belong to? How long had they been on the property? At this stage, the connection to the missing women was not yet fully formed. But the possibility, however faint, began to take shape. It existed in the background, an unspoken consideration that influenced how each new piece of evidence was viewed. The decision to expand the scope of the investigation did not happen all at once. It evolved, step by step, as the weight of what was being uncovered grew harder to contain within the boundaries of the original case. Additional resources were brought in. Specialists who could interpret evidence beyond the initial focus. The process slowed, deepened, became more deliberate. And then came the moment when the nature of the discovery shifted irreversibly. Forensic teams began to uncover remains. Not in a single location, not in a way that provided immediate clarity, but in fragments. Pieces that had to be carefully identified, analyzed, understood. The realization did not arrive as a sudden shock, but as a gradual, unfolding certainty. This was not an isolated incident. This was something far larger. The farm was no longer just a location under investigation. It had become a crime scene of unprecedented scale. The process of examining the property transformed into one of the most extensive forensic operations the country had ever seen. Every inch of land, every structure, every object had to be considered as a potential source of evidence. The work was painstaking, often slow to yield definitive answers. But each new finding added to a picture that was becoming increasingly impossible to deny. The fragments told a story, even when they could not yet be fully assembled. Human remains, scattered across different areas of the property, suggested a pattern of activity that had been ongoing for years. The condition of those remains indicated deliberate attempts to conceal, to destroy, to erase. This was not the result of a single event. It was the accumulation of many. As identification efforts began, the connection to the missing women became undeniable. Names that had once existed in separate reports, in isolated cases, were now being linked through physical evidence. Families who had spent years searching for answers were suddenly confronted with a reality that was both devastating and clarifying. The uncertainty that had defined their experience was being replaced with something far more concrete. But with that clarity came a deeper horror. Because the scale of the discovery suggested that the number of victims was far greater than anyone had confirmed. The investigation, initially focused on a handful of cases, expanded rapidly as new evidence emerged. Each identification led to new questions, new possibilities, new lines of inquiry that extended beyond what had already been uncovered. The farm, once overlooked, became the center of national attention. Media coverage intensified. Public awareness grew. Questions that had lingered at the edges of conversation were now being asked openly, urgently. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? How many victims were there? Could this have been stopped earlier? Within the investigation itself, the challenge was immense. The sheer volume of evidence required coordination across multiple agencies, the application of advanced forensic techniques, the careful management of information that had the potential to reshape the entire case. It was not just about uncovering what had happened, but about doing so in a way that could stand up to scrutiny, that could provide answers with certainty. And yet, even as the evidence mounted, there were limitations. Not every fragment could be identified. Not every question could be answered. The passage of time, combined with the methods used to conceal the crimes, had created gaps that could not be fully closed. For some families, the investigation would provide resolution. For others, it would leave lingering uncertainties, spaces where answers should have been but were no longer accessible. Still, the discovery had changed everything. What had once been a series of disconnected disappearances was now understood as part of a single, ongoing sequence of crimes. The farm had become the link, the place where those separate stories converged into one. And at the center of it all was a man who, until this point, had existed largely outside the scope of serious suspicion. The evidence did not just point to him. It surrounded him. The investigation had moved beyond possibility into certainty. The question was no longer whether crimes had been committed on that property, but how many, over what period of time, and with what level of intent and awareness. As the full scope of the discovery began to take shape, one thing became clear. This was not a case that would be resolved quickly. It would require time, resources, and a level of commitment that extended far beyond the initial investigation. It would demand answers not only about the crimes themselves, but about the systems that had allowed them to continue undetected for so long. Because the discovery was not just about what had been found. It was about everything that had been missed. And in that realization lay a different kind of weight, one that would shape the investigation, the trial, and the broader conversation for years to come. The silence that had once surrounded the farm was gone. In its place was something far more difficult to confront. The truth. By the time the scale of what had been uncovered at the farm in Port Coquitlam began to settle into public consciousness, the investigation had already entered a phase where nothing could be taken at face value anymore. Every assumption was questioned. Every timeline re-examined. What had once been treated as isolated disappearances was now understood as part of a much larger, deeply interconnected pattern, and that realization changed the way investigators approached everything. The challenge was no longer just to prove that crimes had occurred. That part, grim as it was, had become increasingly clear through the physical evidence. The challenge now was to untangle years of activity that had been deliberately obscured, to reconstruct sequences of events that had left behind only fragments, and to do so in a way that could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom. The property itself became both the key and the obstacle. It was vast, chaotic, layered with years of accumulated debris and activity. Every structure, every patch of land, every discarded object carried potential significance. But that same complexity made it extraordinarily difficult to isolate specific events. Evidence did not exist in clean, separate compartments. It overlapped, mixed, degraded over time. Investigators were not just looking for answers, they were trying to extract them from an environment that seemed almost designed to resist clarity. Forensic teams worked in slow, methodical cycles. Soil was sifted, materials catalogued, remains carefully recovered and analyzed. Each discovery required verification, cross-referencing, confirmation through multiple methods. DNA analysis became central, linking fragments to individuals whose disappearances had once been treated as unrelated cases. But even with advances in forensic science, the process was painstaking. Time had altered the evidence in ways that could not be fully reversed. And while the physical investigation continued, another equally complex effort unfolded in parallel. Detectives began reconstructing the social landscape that connected the victims. They returned to Vancouver's downtown East Side, not as observers this time, but as listeners. They spoke with people who had known the missing women, who had shared spaces with them, who had seen them in the days or hours before they disappeared. These conversations were not always easy. Trust had to be rebuilt in a community that had long felt overlooked, dismissed, or misunderstood. Some witnesses were hesitant. Others were more forthcoming, offering details that, while small on their own, contributed to a broader picture. Descriptions of a man, of a vehicle, of interactions that had seemed ordinary at the time but now carried new weight. Memory is fragile, especially when shaped by time and trauma, but patterns began to emerge nonetheless. Again and again, the same elements surfaced. A man who appeared unremarkable. A sense of familiarity that lowered defenses. An offer that seemed routine within the context of the environment. And then, a disappearance that followed shortly after. The name Robert William Picton moved from the periphery of the investigation to its center. But building a case against him required more than suspicion, more than patterns. It required evidence that could directly connect him to specific crimes, that could demonstrate intent, action, and responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. And that is where the investigation encountered its most difficult obstacles. Because while the farm yielded evidence of human remains, linking those remains to individual acts of murder and to a specific perpetrator was not always straightforward. The condition of the evidence, the passage of time, and the methods used to conceal the crimes all contributed to gaps that defense attorneys would later seek to exploit. Investigators had to think not just like detectives, but like prosecutors. They needed to anticipate the challenges that would arise in court. They needed to build a narrative that was not only factually accurate but legally compelling. This meant focusing on cases where the evidence was strongest, where the connections between victim, location, and suspect could be demonstrated with the highest degree of certainty. At the same time, they could not ignore the broader scope of the crimes. The number of potential victims extended far beyond the cases that could be immediately proven. Each additional identification added to the weight of the investigation, but also to its complexity. Resources were finite. Time was limited. Decisions had to be made about where to focus efforts, which cases to prioritize, how to balance the need for comprehensive understanding with the practical realities of prosecution. Within the investigation team, pressure mounted. This was not just another case. It had become a national issue, drawing attention from media, government, and the public. Questions about earlier missed opportunities, about why the disappearances had not been connected sooner, about why warnings from the community had not led to more decisive action, hovered over the investigation, adding a layer of scrutiny that could not be ignored. Internally, this scrutiny translated into urgency. Investigators revisited past reports, looking for moments where the trajectory of the case might have shifted if different decisions had been made. They examined earlier interactions with Picton, including a search conducted years prior that had not resulted in charges. In hindsight, those moments took on new significance, raising difficult questions about what had been seen, what had been missed, and why. But hindsight, while clarifying, does not change the present. The focus remained on building the strongest possible case with the evidence available. As the investigation deepened, additional forms of evidence began to surface. Personal items belonging to victims. Documentation that suggested patterns of behavior. Testimonies from individuals who had interacted with Picton in ways that, at the time, had not seemed significant but now appeared deeply relevant. Each piece added another layer to the case, another point of connection that strengthened the overall narrative. And yet, there were still gaps. Moments that could not be fully reconstructed. Actions that left no trace. Questions that remained unanswered despite extensive effort. These gaps did not invalidate the case, but they introduced uncertainty, areas where the defense could challenge the prosecution's claims, where doubt could be introduced. Managing that uncertainty became a critical part of the investigation. It required careful framing, a clear distinction between what could be proven and what could only be inferred. It required restraint, an understanding that overreaching could weaken the case rather than strengthen it. The goal was not to present every possible scenario, but to present a coherent, evidence-based account that demonstrated guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Outside the investigation, the impact continued to ripple outward. Families of the victims were drawn into the process, some for the first time receiving confirmation of what had happened to their loved ones. The emotional weight of that confirmation was immense. For years, many had lived with uncertainty, with the possibility, however faint, that their daughters, sisters, friends might still be alive. Now, that uncertainty was replaced with a different kind of reality, one that brought answers but also finality. Community advocates pushed for broader recognition of what the case represented. This was not just about one perpetrator. It was about the conditions that had allowed the crimes to continue for so long. About the ways in which certain victims had been overlooked, their disappearances not treated with the urgency they deserved. These conversations began to shape the public narrative, influencing how the case was understood beyond the specifics of the investigation. But within the investigative team, the focus remained precise. Case by case. Evidence by evidence. Building toward a moment where everything would be presented in a courtroom, where the narrative constructed over months of work would be tested under the strictest conditions. That moment was coming. And as it approached, the investigation entered its most critical phase. Every detail was reviewed. Every connection re-examined. The case had to be not just strong, but unassailable. Because once it moved into the courtroom, control would shift. The narrative would no longer belong solely to the investigators. It would be challenged, dissected, contested at every turn. And the outcome would determine not only the fate of the man at the center of it all, but the degree to which justice could be said to have been achieved for those whose stories had brought the investigation to this point. The farm had revealed its secrets. Now, it was up to the investigation to make them undeniable. There is a moment in every long investigation when the chaos begins to organize itself. Not because the case becomes simpler, but because something shifts, something aligns in a way that transforms fragments into structure. 4 years, this case had been defined by absence, by gaps, by the slow accumulation of pieces that refused to fully connect. But now, standing at the edge of everything they had uncovered, investigators began to see a pattern that was no longer abstract. It did not arrive as a single revelation. It came through convergence. Inside the investigation headquarters, walls were no longer just walls. They had become maps of timelines, of relationships, of movements across cities and years. Photographs were pinned beside documents, connected by lines that traced the paths of lives that had intersected in ways no one had fully understood before. Each line represented a possibility at first, then a probability, and finally, something closer to certainty. The name at the center of all those lines was no longer tentative. Robert William Picton had moved from suspect to focal point, not through assumption, but through accumulation. The evidence surrounding him had reached a threshold where it could no longer be interpreted in isolation. Each piece reinforced the others, creating a framework that was increasingly difficult to challenge. But even then, the breakthrough did not come from a single piece of evidence. It came from how those pieces began to interact. Forensic analysis had already established the presence of multiple victims on the farm in Port Coquitlam. DNA results had linked remains to women who had been missing for years, confirming what many had feared but could not prove. Yet the question that remained was one of direct responsibility. It was not enough to show that crimes had occurred on the property. The prosecution needed to demonstrate that Picton himself had committed them. And that required something more. It required a bridge between presence and action. Investigators found that bridge not in a single discovery, but in a combination of elements that, together, formed a narrative too consistent to dismiss. Personal belongings of victims recovered from areas under Picton's control. Testimonies that placed him in direct contact with women shortly before their disappearances. Patterns of behavior that aligned with the timelines being constructed. But the most critical shift came when those elements began to overlap in specific, undeniable ways. One case, then another again, each with its own set of evidence, each reinforcing the same underlying conclusion. The randomness that had once defined the disappearances gave way to repetition. And repetition, in a case like this, becomes a form of proof. Still, the investigation needed more than patterns. It needed moments. Moments where the abstract became concrete. Where the narrative could be anchored in events that could be clearly presented, clearly understood. Investigators returned again and again to specific timelines, reconstructing the last known movements of victims with increasing precision. They mapped out who had seen them, when, under what circumstances. They traced the paths that led from the streets of Vancouver to the isolation of the farm. And within those reconstructions, something began to stand out. Consistency. Different victims, different nights, different details, but the same underlying structure. The same progression from contact to disappearance. The same endpoint. The same location. It was no longer a question of whether these events were connected. It was a question of how to present that connection in a way that could not be broken. The breakthrough, when it fully took shape, was not a single moment of discovery. It was the realization that the case had reached a level of cohesion where it could stand on its own. Where each piece of evidence no longer needed to carry the full weight of proof, because the collective weight had become overwhelming. Within the investigative team, this realization brought both clarity and pressure. Clarity, because the direction was now undeniable. Pressure, because the stakes had never been higher. Every decision from this point forward would shape the outcome of the trial. Every detail would be examined, challenged, tested under conditions that allowed no room for error. The focus narrowed. From dozens of potential cases, investigators began to identify those where the evidence was strongest, where the connections were most direct. It was not an easy decision. Each victim represented a life that deserved recognition, justice, acknowledgement. But the reality of the legal system required selectivity. A smaller number of charges, supported by stronger evidence, would increase the likelihood of conviction. This strategy marked a turning point. The investigation was no longer expanding outward. It was consolidating inward, refining its focus, preparing for the transition from investigation to prosecution. The question was no longer how many victims could be connected to the case, but how many cases could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. At the same time, external pressure continued to build. Public attention had intensified. Media coverage dissected every development, every new piece of information. Families of victims watched closely, hoping that the progress being made would lead to answers that had been denied to them for so long. Community advocates continued to push for broader recognition, ensuring that the narrative did not narrow so much that the full scope of the tragedy was lost. Within this environment, the investigation had to maintain its balance. It could not be driven by emotion, even as emotion surrounded it. It could not be rushed, even as urgency demanded progress. It had to remain grounded in evidence, in procedure, in the careful construction of a case that would hold under the most intense scrutiny. And then, there was the man himself. Picton's presence within the investigation was both central and elusive. He was not a figure who fit easily into expectations. There was no dramatic persona, no overt display that matched the scale of the crimes he was now associated with. Instead, there was a quietness, a lack of expression that made interpretation difficult. His interactions with investigators, with those around him, did not provide clear insight into his internal state. This ambiguity added another layer to the case. Because while the evidence pointed toward him, understanding his actions, his motivations, his patterns remained complex. Investigators could reconstruct what had happened, but the why remained less accessible. And in a case like this, the absence of clear motive does not weaken the evidence, but it does shape how the narrative is understood. As the breakthrough solidified, the investigation reached its final phase. Evidence was organized, documented, prepared for presentation. Witnesses were identified, their testimonies reviewed, their roles within the broader narrative clarified. Forensic findings were compiled into reports that translated complex scientific data into conclusions that could be communicated effectively in court. Everything was moving toward a single point: the trial. It would be there, in a courtroom far removed from the farm where the crimes had taken place, that the investigation would be tested. Where the narrative built over years would be challenged by a defense seeking to introduce doubt. Where the evidence would need to stand not just as a collection of findings, but as a coherent, compelling account of what had happened. The breakthrough had made that possible. It had transformed uncertainty into structure, suspicion into evidence, fragments into a case. But it had not brought closure. That would depend on what came next. Because in the transition from investigation to justice, the story changes again. The focus shifts from what happened to what can be proven. From discovery to accountability. And in that shift, the outcome is never guaranteed. Only the evidence is. And now, finally, there was enough of it to move forward. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the story had already traveled a long distance, from quiet disappearances in the streets of Vancouver to the sprawling, contaminated grounds of a farm in Port Coquitlam. But inside the courtroom, all of that distance had to be compressed into something precise, structured, and legally undeniable. Years of investigation, thousands of pieces of evidence, and the weight of dozens of lives lost now had to be translated into a format governed by rules that allowed no ambiguity. The room itself did not reflect the magnitude of what it contained. It was controlled, deliberate, almost restrained in its design. Rows of seats. A raised bench. Tables where opposing sides prepared to present entirely different interpretations of the same reality. There was no chaos here, no visible trace of the disorder that had defined the investigation. Everything was measured, contained within a system built to filter truth through process. At the center of it all sat Robert William Picton. He did not command attention in the way many might expect. There was no dramatic presence, no outward display that matched the scale of the accusations against him. He appeared small within the space, almost ordinary, his demeanor offering little insight into the gravity of the proceedings. For those watching, especially the families of the victims, this contrast was difficult to reconcile. How could something so vast, so devastating, be connected to someone who seemed so unremarkable? But the courtroom does not operate on impressions. It operates on evidence. The prosecution's task was clear, though far from simple. They needed to present a case that did not rely on the emotional weight of the story, but on the strength of the connections they had built. They had chosen to focus on 6 counts of second-degree murder, not because there were only 6 victims, but because these were the cases where the evidence was strongest, where the links between victim, location, and defendant could be demonstrated with the highest degree of certainty. This decision, while strategic, carried its own tension. For the families of other victims, it raised difficult questions. What about the others? What about the names that had been connected through investigation but would not be formally addressed in this trial? The courtroom, by necessity, narrowed the scope of the story. It focused on what could be proven, not on everything that might be true. As the trial began, the prosecution moved carefully. They did not attempt to overwhelm the court with volume. Instead, they constructed a narrative piece by piece, each element reinforcing the next. Forensic evidence formed the foundation. DNA analysis linking remains found on the farm to specific victims. Physical evidence placing those victims within spaces controlled by Picton. Items that should not have been there, existing in contexts that could not be explained away as coincidence. Experts took the stand, translating complex scientific findings into language the court could understand. They spoke of processes, of methods, of probabilities that approached certainty. They did not speculate. They presented conclusions grounded in data, in analysis, in procedures designed to eliminate doubt. Then came the testimonies. Witnesses who had seen the victims in the days before they disappeared. Individuals who had interacted with Picton, who could place him in proximity to those victims at critical moments. Their accounts were not always dramatic. Often, they were quiet, measured, shaped by memory that had been revisited many times. But within those accounts, patterns emerged, consistent, repeating, aligning with the broader narrative the prosecution was building. The defense, in turn, approached the case from a different angle. They did not need to prove innocence in the way the prosecution needed to prove guilt. Their task was to introduce doubt, to challenge the certainty of the connections being presented. They questioned the handling of evidence, the interpretation of forensic findings, the reliability of witness testimony. They highlighted gaps, inconsistencies, areas where the narrative relied on inference rather than direct observation. In a case built on fragments, those gaps were inevitable. The defense focused on them with precision, attempting to widen them into spaces large enough to create reasonable doubt. They questioned whether the presence of remains on the farm necessarily meant that Picton was responsible for the deaths. They suggested alternative possibilities, however unlikely, because in the courtroom, even unlikely possibilities can carry weight if they cannot be definitively excluded. The trial became a process of tension between these two approaches. On one side, a narrative of accumulation, where each piece of evidence reinforced a single conclusion. On the other, a narrative of fragmentation, where each piece was examined in isolation, its certainty questioned, its implications narrowed. For the jury, the task was immense. They were not just evaluating evidence. They were navigating a story that extended beyond the confines of the courtroom, a story they had likely encountered through media coverage, through public discourse. They had to set all of that aside, to focus only on what was presented before them, to apply the standard of proof that the law required. Beyond the legal arguments, The emotional weight of the trial was unavoidable. Families of the victims were present, their experiences woven into the proceedings even when they were not speaking. They listened as details of the case were presented, as the lives of their loved ones were discussed in terms that were necessarily clinical, structured, removed from the personal realities those lives had once contained. For them, this was not just a trial. It was a confrontation with loss, with confirmation, with a form of closure that was both necessary and deeply painful. As the trial progressed, the narrative solidified. The prosecution's case, built on the convergence of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and pattern analysis, reached a point where its internal consistency became its greatest strength. The defense continued to challenge, to question, to probe for weaknesses, but the overall structure held. And then, the moment arrived. The jury withdrew to deliberate. Time, which had stretched across years of investigation and months of trial, seemed to compress again into something more immediate. The outcome now rested in the hands of a small group of individuals tasked with reaching a unanimous decision based on everything they had seen and heard. When the verdict was delivered, it carried the weight of all that had come before. Guilty. 6 counts of second-degree murder. The word itself was simple, but its implications were profound. It represented the court's acceptance of the prosecution's narrative, the confirmation that the evidence presented had met the standard required to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. For the families, the verdict brought a form of acknowledgement. It did not erase the years of uncertainty, the loss, the questions that would never be fully answered. But it provided something concrete, a recognition within the legal system that what had happened to their loved ones mattered, that it had been seen, examined, and judged. For Picton, the sentence followed. Life imprisonment, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. It was the maximum penalty available under the law for the charges he faced. A sentence that ensured he would spend the remainder of his life within the confines of the system that had now judged him. But even as the sentence was pronounced, there was an awareness that this was not the end of the story. Because the trial had addressed only a portion of the case. The broader scope, the full number of victims, the unanswered questions, the systemic failures that had allowed the crimes to continue for so long remained outside the boundaries of the courtroom's decision. Additional charges were stayed, not pursued, a decision made to avoid prolonging the legal process, but one that left a sense of incompleteness for many. Justice, in this context, was both achieved and limited. It had identified a perpetrator, established accountability, delivered a verdict that reflected the evidence presented. But it had not, and perhaps could not, fully encompass the scale of what had occurred. As the courtroom emptied, as the formal processes concluded, what remained was a complex reality. A man had been convicted. Lives had been acknowledged. But the deeper questions about how it had happened, why it had gone unnoticed for so long, and what it meant for the future would continue to resonate far beyond the walls of that room. Because justice, in cases like this, is never just about the verdict. It is about what comes after. The courtroom doors closed, but the echoes of the trial lingered far beyond that chamber. Outside, in the streets of Vancouver and the surrounding towns, there was a mixture of relief, grief, and lingering disbelief. Families who had spent years grappling with uncertainty now faced a reality that was painfully concrete. They had the verdict, the sentence, the undeniable confirmation that their loved ones had been taken in the most unimaginable way. Yet even with that, the wounds were raw, and the healing had only just begun. There was no closure that could erase the horror of what had been uncovered on that farm in Port Coquitlam, no verdict that could reconstruct the lives that had been stolen, or soothe the enduring trauma of those left behind. The city itself seemed to exhale, a long, collective release after years of tension and fear. Vancouver's downtown east side had been cast into the national spotlight, a place whose vulnerabilities had been exploited and whose struggles had been ignored. The community grappled with the realization that the disappearances of dozens of women, many of them marginalized, had unfolded under the eyes of a system that had failed to act quickly enough. The anger and frustration were palpable. Advocates, families, and residents demanded change, scrutiny of law enforcement procedures, and systemic reform to ensure that future vulnerabilities would not be met with neglect. The trial had revealed more than a single criminal, it had revealed gaps, blind spots, and societal failings that allowed the crimes to continue undetected for so long. Law enforcement agencies were forced into reflection. Questions about the initial 1997 investigation, about missed opportunities, about the methods and priorities of the police, were no longer hypothetical. Public hearings and inquiries followed, examining the reasons why early signs had gone unheeded and why the patterns were not recognized sooner. For the detectives involved in the case, there was a mixture of vindication and remorse. They had eventually pieced together a case strong enough to bring a serial killer to justice, yet they were acutely aware that earlier action might have saved lives. The investigation's breakthrough and the eventual conviction became a study in persistence, forensic innovation, and the relentless pursuit of truth, but it was also a cautionary tale about the consequences of delay and oversight. Meanwhile, the impact on the criminal justice system and Canadian society was profound. The Picton case prompted a re-evaluation of how disappearances, particularly of marginalized women, were prioritized and investigated. It sparked new protocols for interagency communication, forensic procedures, and victim advocacy. Training programs for police officers were revised to include more attention to patterns of vulnerability, and community outreach was expanded to rebuild trust in neighborhoods that had long felt invisible. The case became a reference point for criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals studying serial offenses, behavioral profiling, and the intersection of social neglect and criminal opportunity. Picton himself became, chillingly, a subject of analysis, a study in predatory behavior, obsessive repetition, and the exploitation of isolation. For the families, life after the trial was neither simple nor linear. Some found a measure of relief in the acknowledgement of their loved ones' deaths and the sentencing of their killer. Others wrestled with anger at the systemic failures that had allowed the crimes to continue, questioning why their children, sisters, and friends had been left unprotected. Grief mingled with advocacy, mourning became inseparable from a commitment to ensuring that the lives lost were not forgotten and that future women in vulnerable positions would not be rendered invisible. Support networks emerged, survivor communities strengthened, and stories once silenced began to be shared more openly. Each remembrance, each commemoration, each act of advocacy became a testament to resilience amid incomprehensible tragedy. The farm in Port Coquitlam, once the silent stage for decades of horror, was emptied, its structures demolished, its land cleansed in an attempt to erase physical reminders of the crimes. Yet no demolition could erase the psychological imprint, the knowledge that somewhere, behind closed doors and fences, countless lives had been shattered. The location remained a symbol of the danger that can emerge when isolation, vulnerability, and neglect intersect. It stood as a reminder that evil can grow unnoticed when society looks away, that vigilance and compassion are necessary defenses against predation, and that justice is most meaningful when it extends beyond punishment to prevention. Picton's incarceration, while absolute in its terms, could not undo what had happened. He would spend his life confined, removed from society, but the memory of his actions would persist, haunting the community, shaping public consciousness, and informing policy for years to come. Conversations about safety, support for marginalized populations, and the responsibilities of institutions were forever altered. The trial had delivered a verdict, but it had also illuminated the human cost of delay, ignorance, and social indifference, ensuring that the lessons learned would resonate far beyond the individual case. In the quiet moments that followed, for those who had fought to uncover the truth, there was a somber recognition: justice is not restoration. It is acknowledgement, accountability, and the careful balancing of evidence and principle. It is the declaration that lives stolen and violated do matter, even if the full scope of loss can never be entirely measured. The Picton case became a benchmark not only for law enforcement and criminal justice, but for society at large, illustrating the depths of human cruelty, the vulnerabilities of the overlooked, and the imperative of vigilance, compassion, and diligence. Ultimately, the aftermath of the case is a landscape of contrasts: grief and relief, horror and understanding, failure and reform. It is a reminder of the fragility of safety, the persistence of evil, and the capacity of human systems, when fully committed, to uncover truth and deliver accountability. The echoes of Port Coquitlam, of those lost and of those who pursued justice, continue to reverberate. They carry a message as stark as it is vital, that vigilance must never waver, that voices once silenced must be heard, and that even amid the darkest truths, the pursuit of justice remains a moral imperative that defines the very fabric of society. Even after the gavel fell and the prison gates closed behind Robert William Picton, the reverberations of his crimes refused to fade. Time did not heal in the usual sense, instead, it layered new complexities atop old wounds. Families who had spent decades in uncertainty now had confirmation, but confirmation brought with it a weight that could not be measured. The relief of accountability was intertwined with a persistent grief, a haunting reminder that some voids can never be filled. Each life lost was irreplaceable, each story cut short leaving behind questions that no verdict could answer. Yet within this tragedy, there emerged a determination, a resolve to ensure that the darkness of the past would illuminate paths for the future. Society, forced to confront its own shortcomings, began to change, though unevenly and imperfectly. The downtown east side of Vancouver became more than a site of vulnerability, it became a symbol of systemic neglect, of social invisibility, and of the dangers inherent when marginalized populations are overlooked. Advocates amplified their calls for protective measures, for mental health services, for addiction support, and for law enforcement reform. The Picton case became a reference point in debates about public policy, resource allocation, and community accountability. It reminded citizens and officials alike that preventing tragedy requires attention, compassion, and vigilance long before evidence accumulates or crimes reach catastrophic magnitude. In classrooms, in law enforcement academies, and in criminal psychology programs, Picton's crimes became a case study of both horror and methodology. Not in a sensationalized sense, but as a framework for understanding how patterns of vulnerability can be exploited, how offenders operate over years without detection, and how investigative persistence can eventually bring truth to light. Behavioral analysts examined the routines, the isolation, the incremental escalation, and the meticulous ways in which victims were selected and controlled. They studied the environment of the farm, the social dynamics of the victims, and the psychological profile of the perpetrator. Every lecture, every paper, every discussion acknowledged the human cost behind the data, the families, the survivors, the community traumatized. The media coverage, once intrusive and sensational, eventually shifted toward reflective reporting, chronicling not just the crimes, but the broader implications. Documentaries, articles, and podcasts examined the societal blind spots, the failures of early interventions, and the lessons for systemic reform. Public discourse began to focus on how communities can prevent isolation, how vulnerable populations can be safeguarded, and how investigative bodies can balance skepticism with urgency. The Picton case became a mirror, forcing society to confront uncomfortable truths about who is seen, who is ignored, and what happens when indifference allows predators to operate unchecked. For the victims' families, the aftermath extended far beyond the trial. They navigated grief alongside advocacy, often channeling their trauma into activism. Support networks formed, connecting families who had experienced similar horrors, creating spaces where loss could be acknowledged without judgment. These networks became crucial in lobbying for better social services, legal reform, and protective initiatives for at-risk individuals. In many ways, the community that had been fractured by fear began to reconstruct itself through collective action, remembrance, and education. Memorials, commemorative events, and public forums ensured that the victims were not reduced to statistics but were remembered as people with lives, relationships, and dreams cut tragically short. Psychologically, the Picton case continues to fascinate and horrify experts because it challenges conventional understanding of human behavior. He demonstrated an ability to compartmentalize, to present an ordinary exterior while committing atrocities over an extended period. His crimes highlighted the interplay of opportunity, predation, and social neglect. Analysts argue that without the particular combination of isolation, vulnerability, and oversight, such prolonged criminal activity might never have been possible. This understanding reinforces the importance of societal responsibility alongside criminal accountability. Preventing future tragedies, experts stress, is not solely the role of law enforcement, it is a shared obligation that includes community engagement, social services, and awareness. Even in prisons, Picton remains a figure of study and discussion. His behavior behind bars, his interactions with staff, and his psychological profile are monitored and examined. While incarcerated, he is physically removed from society, but the lessons derived from his actions continue to permeate public policy, criminal profiling, and investigative methodologies. There is a strange duality to his existence now. He is both contained and influential, his actions echoing far beyond the walls that confine him. Yet beyond the analytical lens, there is a deeply human lesson. The Picton case is a reminder of the fragility of safety, the consequences of neglect, and the moral imperative to notice, to care, and to act. Every life lost was a warning, every missed opportunity a reflection of societal blind spots. The tragedy compels a reckoning not only with the individual criminal but with the structures that allowed him to operate undetected. It forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, marginalization, and human oversight. Ultimately, the epilogue of this story is not just about a man or a trial. It is about awareness, accountability, and the enduring responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable. The echoes of Port Coquitlam, of the women whose lives ended too soon, of the families left behind, serve as both a memorial and a call to vigilance. Even decades later, the case challenges each listener, each reader, each community to ask themselves, how will we ensure that the invisible are seen, that the unheard are heard, and that the next tragedy does not unfold in silence? The Picton saga, horrific in its details and devastating in its impact, leaves behind an indelible lesson. Justice is necessary but not sufficient. Society must be awake, attentive, and proactive. The echoes of those lost, the lessons of systemic failure, and the resilience of survivors converge into a message as stark as it is urgent. Awareness is a defense, vigilance is a responsibility, and remembrance is a moral obligation. In honoring the victims, society must commit to seeing, listening, and acting so that their stories are never forgotten, and so that the darkness that allowed such crimes to persist can never gain the same hold again. The shadows cast by the farm in Port Coquitlam may never fully disappear, but in the careful work of remembrance, education, and reform, they can illuminate paths toward protection, understanding, and collective responsibility. The crimes of Robert William Picton serve as a grim chronicle, but the responses, both institutional and human, can be enduring reminders that even in the darkest narratives, there is potential for awareness, change, and, above all, vigilance. The story of Robert William Picton did not end with the final verdict, nor with the epilogue of grief and societal reflection. Its legacy extends into every corner of Canadian life touched by the case, and far beyond, into discussions of vulnerability, justice, and human responsibility. Decades after the crimes, the shadow of the farm in Port Coquitlam still serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of inquiry for those seeking to understand how such horrors could unfold unchecked. It is a reminder that evil often thrives not only because of intention but because of absence, the absence of oversight, the absence of protection, the absence of awareness. At the heart of the legacy lies a confrontation with societal blindness. The downtown east side of Vancouver, where many of Picton's victims had lived and worked, was already a neighborhood marked by hardship, addiction, and marginalization. For years, the disappearances of women in this area were documented but not prioritized. Complaints, sightings, missing person reports, they accumulated into an unheeded chorus of concern. Picton's crimes forced a reckoning with this neglect. The public was confronted not only with the actions of a single predator but with the structural failings that enabled him. Policies were scrutinized, investigative priorities questioned, and awareness campaigns launched to prevent the next iteration of such a tragedy. The legacy is thus inseparable from lessons about vigilance. It is not enough to punish wrongdoing after the fact. Society must actively safeguard its most vulnerable members to prevent tragedy in the first place. In law enforcement circles, the Picton case became a benchmark of procedural and forensic evolution. The scale and complexity of the crimes exposed weaknesses in investigative methods that had previously been overlooked. Communication gaps between agencies, inconsistencies in handling missing person cases, and the lack of systematic forensic approaches were all highlighted. In response, investigative frameworks across Canada underwent significant reform. Multi-agency task forces became standard for handling long-term disappearances. Forensic laboratories expanded their capacity to process DNA evidence, and cold cases began to receive renewed attention with modern technology. Picton's crimes demonstrated the importance of integrating investigative persistence with technological innovation, a lesson that continues to shape criminal investigations today. Beyond procedural lessons, the case has had profound psychological and criminological implications. Behavioral analysts, sociologists, and psychologists have studied Picton as a stark example of predatory exploitation combined with extreme social detachment. His ability to present a facade of ordinariness, to lure victims through a combination of promises, manipulation, and opportunity, challenges assumptions about detection and profiling. Researchers examine his repetitive methods, the isolation of his operational environment, and the psychological vulnerabilities he exploited. The case is now central to academic discussions on serial offenders, victimology, and the interplay between individual pathology and systemic failure. These analyses underscore that understanding such behavior is not merely theoretical, it is essential for preventing future atrocities. The families of the victims, while deeply scarred by loss, have contributed to this legacy in profound ways. Many transformed grief into activism, becoming voices for social change, legal reform, and victim advocacy. Organizations and support networks were strengthened or established to protect vulnerable populations, particularly women involved in sex work or struggling with addiction. Memorials and public events keep the memories of those lost alive while also highlighting broader societal responsibilities. These acts of remembrance and advocacy demonstrate that even in the aftermath of unfathomable loss, communities can forge paths toward resilience, awareness, and systemic change. Their work ensures that the lessons of the Picton case extend far beyond courtroom proceedings and legal documentation. Media and popular culture have also engaged with the legacy, though with mixed effects. Documentaries, books, and investigative reports chronicling Picton's crimes have reached international audiences, drawing attention to both the horror and the systemic lessons embedded in the case. Responsible storytelling emphasizes the humanity of the victims and the gravity of institutional oversight failures, while sensationalist portrayals risk trivializing the suffering of those involved. The challenge for society has been to balance education and remembrance with respect for the lived experiences of the victims and their families. When done thoughtfully, media coverage has become an instrument for advocacy, public education, and the promotion of systemic change. One of the most enduring legacies of the Picton case is its influence on public consciousness regarding vulnerability and social invisibility. Communities across Canada began to recognize that marginalized populations, particularly women living in poverty or struggling with addiction, are often at higher risk of predation and neglect. The case spurred policy debates about social services, urban safety, law enforcement priorities, and preventive interventions. It illuminated the moral and practical imperative of social vigilance, that protecting the invisible and vulnerable is not optional but central to the health and integrity of a society. In this sense, Picton's crimes, horrific as they were, catalyzed a broader cultural reflection about responsibility, empathy, and communal duty. Education became a crucial vehicle for this legacy. Law schools, criminology programs, and social work courses integrated the Picton case into curricula, not as sensationalism but as instruction in human risk, systemic failure, and the necessity of cross-disciplinary intervention. Students analyze the case to understand how social systems can either enable or prevent tragedy. They learn that the responsibility for safety extends beyond law enforcement, encompassing social services, community advocacy, and policymaking. The enduring lesson is clear: when society overlooks the marginalized, it creates opportunities for predation. When it acts deliberately, informed by evidence and compassion, it can mitigate risk and potentially save lives. Perhaps the most sobering aspect of Picton's legacy lies in its psychological echo. His crimes force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human capacity for evil, the fragility of societal safety nets, and the consequences of indifference. The scale of his offenses, combined with the prolonged period in which they went unnoticed, challenges our assumptions about detection, intervention, and morality. It reminds us that vigilance requires more than casual awareness, it demands active engagement, community solidarity, and institutional accountability. Without these, the darkness that allowed Picton to operate could find other forms, other perpetrators, in other contexts. Yet alongside this sobering reality exists the potential for transformation. Communities have become more aware, policies have been strengthened, and families have turned grief into action. The Picton case, horrific in its details, has generated lessons that ripple outward, a heightened understanding of systemic vulnerability, a commitment to victim advocacy, and an enduring insistence on accountability. The echoes of Port Coquitlam now carry dual messages: a warning of what can happen when society looks away, and a call to ensure that those who are vulnerable are never invisible again. Ultimately, the legacy of Robert William Picton is not defined solely by his crimes but by the societal awakening they provoked. It is defined by the lives lost and the lives that were mobilized in response. It is defined by changes in policy, law enforcement, education, and public consciousness. It is a reminder that true vigilance is ongoing, that justice is both a process and a responsibility, and that the most profound lessons often emerge from the darkest human realities. In reflecting on this legacy, society is compelled to carry forward awareness, advocacy, and action, ensuring that the horrors uncovered in Port Coquitlam serve not only as a record of tragedy but as a guide for prevention, protection, and the enduring pursuit of justice. Even years after Robert William Picton's arrest and conviction, the echoes of his crimes stretch far beyond the walls of the prison that now confines him. The landscape of Port Coquitlam, once an isolated farm hidden behind gates and fences, has transformed physically, yet it remains a symbol of a darkness that no demolition or clearing of land could erase. The fields and barns that once held unspeakable horrors have been emptied, scrubbed, and sold, but the memory of what transpired there continues to haunt. It exists not as a tangible presence but as a psychological scar etched into the community, the families of the victims, and the broader national consciousness. The notion that such brutality could exist so close, so quietly, is a persistent shadow that refuses to dissipate. For families, the passage of time has not softened the edges of grief, it has reframed it. They live with a dual consciousness, one in which justice has been served, and another in which absence is permanent. Birthdays, anniversaries, and milestones arrive with an awareness that is both intimate and isolating. The women lost were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. They were part of complex networks of love and dependency now ruptured. Families grapple with the knowledge that these were lives cut abruptly, violently, and in ways that denied them the dignity of ordinary human existence. Yet in confronting this, many have chosen to transform grief into sustained advocacy, building organizations that work to protect vulnerable populations, raise awareness about violence against women, and provide support for survivors of abuse, addiction, and social marginalization. Their efforts have created a living legacy, one of vigilance, community care, and the insistence that the invisible be made visible. The societal impact extends further. The Picton case exposed systemic failings at multiple levels: law enforcement, social services, healthcare, and public awareness. Policymakers and city planners were forced to reconsider how marginalized communities are treated and monitored, and how missing person reports are prioritized. The downtown east side of Vancouver, long associated with poverty, addiction, and sex work, became a national focal point for social reform and crime prevention. Social workers, police officers, and local authorities began integrating lessons from the case into their daily practices, with the explicit aim of identifying vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. Training protocols were revised, interagency communication improved, and forensic technologies were adapted to allow for quicker and more precise responses to disappearances. Picton's crimes, horrifying as they were, catalyzed changes that would potentially prevent similar tragedies in the future. The psychological ramifications of the case continue to captivate experts and the public alike. Picton, with his ability to manipulate, isolate, and methodically harm, represents a chilling study in predatory behavior. Criminologists and behavioral psychologists dissect his patterns not merely to satisfy morbid curiosity but to understand the conditions under which such behavior can emerge. They examine his solitary lifestyle, the choice of victims, his repeated methods, and his ability to evade detection for years. Every discovery, from skeletal remains scattered across a farm to the corroborated witness accounts of abduction and murder, has provided critical insight into the mind of a serial offender. This analysis has contributed to criminal profiling methodologies worldwide, reinforcing the necessity of combining behavioral study with active, community-oriented investigation. Media and culture have also played a role in perpetuating the shadows of this case. Books, documentaries, and investigative podcasts recount the horrors in minute detail, walking audiences through both the crimes and the systemic failures that allowed them to persist. Responsible narratives attempt to humanize the victims, portraying their lives, struggles, and dreams rather than reducing them to statistics or sensational headlines. Yet there is a tension inherent in retelling such stories. The same accounts that educate and advocate can also inadvertently sensationalize. The balance between public awareness and respect for the victim's humanity is delicate, requiring storytellers to navigate ethical responsibilities while conveying the full scope of the crimes. One of the most profound elements of the ongoing legacy is the conversation it sparks about societal responsibility. Picton exploited gaps, weaknesses, and oversights. His ability to operate for over a decade without interruption was not only the result of personal cunning but also of social neglect. Communities, institutions, and individuals must now confront uncomfortable questions about collective vigilance. How are vulnerable populations protected? Which lives are rendered invisible by systemic bias, poverty, or stigma? What responsibilities do neighbors, authorities, and governments share in preventing such predation? The Picton case has transformed from a story of individual horror into a reflection of societal accountability. Education has become a central pillar of this legacy. Law enforcement training programs, social work curricula, and public policy courses now integrate the Picton case as a touchstone. Students and trainees examine the failures and successes, the investigative breakthroughs, and the complex interplay of social, psychological, and institutional factors that defined the case. Beyond academics, awareness campaigns in communities emphasize the importance of vigilance, reporting, and advocacy. The cultural memory of the case has evolved into a living lesson, reinforcing the principle that safety is a collective responsibility and that inattention can have catastrophic consequences. The emotional resonance of the case lingers, particularly in how it shapes conversations about gender, power, and vulnerability. The victims were overwhelmingly women from marginalized backgrounds, and their stories highlight ongoing disparities in how society prioritizes the safety of different populations. Activists and advocates emphasize that justice is incomplete without recognition of systemic inequities and sustained efforts to address them. The Picton case remains a stark illustration of how intersecting factors, gender, social status, addiction, and visibility can create vulnerabilities that predators exploit. It is a reminder that legal accountability must be complemented by social reform and moral awareness. Even decades later, the narrative of Picton casts long shadows over the cultural imagination. The farm, the victims, the trial, and the family's struggles form a constellation of human experience, fear, loss, endurance, advocacy that continues to shape Canadian society. Public consciousness has absorbed the story as both cautionary tale and moral lesson. The case serves as a persistent reminder that vigilance is not a static act but a continuous engagement with the world, an ongoing commitment to noticing, listening, and acting in defense of those who might otherwise be overlooked. Ultimately, the shadows that remain are not only the legacy of horror but also the legacy of responsibility. Communities, policymakers, families, and individuals are left with the imperative to carry forward the lessons of Port Coquitlam. Awareness, advocacy, and systemic reform are the tools through which society can honor the victims and reduce the possibility that such crimes will ever be repeated. In the lingering quiet of reflection, the Picton case insists upon a vigilance that is ethical, practical, and relentless, a reminder that darkness can thrive in silence, but that knowledge, compassion, and action are the lights that can prevent it from doing so again. The story of Robert William Picton, horrific and unrelenting, concludes not with a sense of closure but with a challenge to recognize the vulnerable, to protect the overlooked, and to carry forward an awareness that ensures the mistakes of the past do not echo unheeded into the future. In the shadows of his crimes, society finds the impetus to act, to reform, and to remember, transforming the legacy of horror into a lasting commitment to vigilance and human dignity.